The fog over the Narragansett Bay never truly cleared. It just changed density. On mornings like this, when the humidity hung so thick it felt like wet wool against the skin, the multi-million-dollar mansions of Newport, Rhode Island, looked less like monuments to old American wealth and more like ghosts carved from granite. My name is Clara Vance. For 26 years, I believed that if you worked hard enough, the structure you built with your own hands would protect you from the weather. I was raised in the shadow of Vance Marine Enterprises, a company my grandfather started with a single dry dock and a box of rusted caulking tools in the late 1950s. By the time my father, Arthur Vance, took the helm, we weren't just repairing commercial fishing trawlers, we were building the custom carbon fiber hull yachts that billionaires used to race across the Atlantic. My older brothers, Julian and Sterling, were the princes of Bellevue Avenue. They went to Choate, then to Yale, and eventually took up residence in the wood-paneled executive offices on the top floor of our shipyard terminal, overlooking the harbor. They spent their days discussing private equity, international yachting syndicates, and the precise vintage of champagne to serve at the annual Heritage Gala. I, on the other hand, went to Rhode Island School of Design for Marine Architecture and Materials Science. I spent my days in a pair of oil-stained Carhartt overalls down in the belly of 60-foot racing hulls, checking the ultrasonic scans of carbon fiber laminates from microscopic voids that could cause a boat to delaminate and crack open in a heavy sea. I knew every shipwright, every master welder, and every supplier from Maine to Virginia. I was the person who smelled of resin, fiberglass dust, and cutting oil. "You have the mind of a tradesman, Clara," Julian used to tell me, his voice smooth as polished teak. He would stand at the edge of the dry dock, careful not to let the overspray from the paint booths touch his cashmere overcoat. "You're too focused on the bolts. A true executive focuses on the horizon." "The horizon doesn't matter if your keel drops off 300 miles from shore, Julian," I would reply, adjusting my respirator around my neck, but the family dynamic was manageable as long as our father was alive to anchor it. Arthur Vance was a hard man, but he respected the physical reality of the ocean. He knew that a ship didn't care about a family's social standing or their balance sheet, it only cared about integrity. Then, during the exceptionally cold winter of 2024, my father's heart failed while he was walking the docks during a northeast gale. He was found frozen near the slipway of our flagship vessel, the Aegis. Within 3 weeks of the funeral, the atmosphere in the executive suite shifted from grief to calculation. The real betrayal didn't happen with a sudden shout or a dramatic gesture. It happened over a quiet, catered lunch in the formal boardroom, surrounded by oil paintings of ships we no longer owned. "Clara, pass the water pitcher, would you?" Sterling said, his eyes glued to a sleek tablet screen. He was 32, 3 years older than Julian, and possessed the kind of sharp, predatory handsomeness that looked excellent in corporate profiles. I slid the crystal pitcher across the polished mahogany table. "Julian, did you review the stress testing data I sent over regarding the new eco-carbon hulls? If we implement the vacuum-infused resin system I've been prototyping in Workshop 4, we can reduce hull weight by 12% while increasing torsional rigidity. It makes us the prime candidates for the Coast Guard's new high-speed patrol boat contract." Julian let out a soft, dry laugh, not looking up from his notes. "The Coast Guard contract is small potatoes, Clara. It's government bureaucracy, low margins, and endless auditing. We are aiming higher. We've been in confidential talks with Vanguard Maritime Holdings, a private equity firm out of New York. They want to buy a controlling 80% stake in Vance Marine." The air left my lungs in a cold rush. "Sell? Grandfather built this yard so we would never have to answer to Wall Street. We have a backlog of custom orders that keeps our workers paid through 2030. "Your workers are an expensive liability, Clara," Sterling said smoothly, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table. "Vanguard doesn't want the artisan shipyard model. They want the brand name. They plan to automate the hull construction, outsource the carbon fiber fabrication to a facility in various cheaper manufacturing zones, and convert the Newport waterfront property into luxury condominiums and a private mega-yacht marina." "You're talking about destroying the yard," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You're talking about firing 90 master shipwrights whose families have worked these docks for 3 generations. We are talking about a $300 million liquidity event," Julian corrected, his voice hardening. "And that brings us to your place in this family, Clara. Vanguard wants a clean corporate governance sheet. They don't want a rogue family member running around the dry docks in grease-stained pants, messing with proprietary engineering designs and causing liability issues with the labor unions. I own 20% of the voting stock, I reminded them, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Father left it to me explicitly in his personal trust. Sterling smiled, a small terrible movement of his lips. Father left you 20% of the original family trust, Clara. But Julian and I executed the corporate restructuring clause that Father signed during his illness last November. The voting shares were consolidated into a management tier controlled exclusively by the co-CEOs. That's us. He slid a thick, blue-bound document across the mahogany table. It looked like a tombstone. You're being bought out, Julian said. $10 million. It's an incredibly generous sum for someone who has spent her life playing with fiberglass, but it comes with conditions. You sign over all intellectual property rights to the vacuum infusion designs you've been working on. You vacate your office and workshop 4 by 5 o'clock tonight, and you sign a 5-year ironclad non-compete clause covering marine architecture anywhere on the eastern seaboard. I stared at the document. The text blurred before my eyes, then snapped into sharp focus. My brothers hadn't just arranged a sale, they had spent the months of our father's decline systematically building a cage for me. They saw me as an embarrassment, the sister who preferred the company of mechanics and welders to the country club set, and they saw my engineering patents as a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder to fund their lifestyle. And if I don't sign? I asked. Then we tie you up in litigation for the next 10 years, Sterling said, his voice completely devoid of warmth. We will freeze your trust distributions, declare your patents the exclusive property of Vance Marine under the standard employee handbook clauses, and bar you from the property immediately for corporate espionage. You don't have the money to fight our corporate lawyers, Clara. Take the 10 million. Buy a nice house in Martha's Vineyard. Go paint pictures of the ocean. Leave the business to the adults. I looked out the panoramic window. Down on the tarmac, an old shipwright named Thomas was instructing a young apprentice on how to true a propeller shaft by ear, listening to the strike of a brass mallet against the steel. They were about to lose everything because 2 men wanted to see a larger number in their bank accounts. I won't sign the non-compete, I said, my voice perfectly level, and I won't sell my personal patents for the vacuum infusion systems. Those were filed under my independent LLC before I signed my current employment agreement with Vance Marine. Julian's eyes narrowed. Clara, don't be stupid. We will ruin you. You can try, I said. I stood up, leaving my chair perfectly straight. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I looked at my brothers, the men who shared my blood but not an ounce of my father's honor. Keep your 10 million, keep the corporate shell. But the soul of this yard doesn't belong to you, and it never will. I walked out of the boardroom, down the spiral staircase, and into the cool, damp air of the shipyard. By 4 in the afternoon, I had loaded my grandfather's old wooden toolbox, my digital drafting tablets, and my personal reference manuals into the back of my battered Ford F-150. As I drove past the security gates, the security guard, a man named Marcus who had given me pieces of saltwater taffy when I was 6 years old, looked at me with confusion. "Leaving early today, Miss Clara?" he asked. "Permanently, Marcus," I said, forcing a smile. "Take care of yourself." "You too, Clara." "The weather's turning. Looks like a storm coming in from the south." "Let it come," I said. "Revenge is not a sudden explosion. It is a slow, methodical calculation of structural stress. If you apply pressure to the wrong point of a ship's hull, the wood simply flexes and absorbs the blow. But if you find the exact point where the keel meets the floor timbers, the single locus of structural tension, and apply even a minor force, the entire vessel will tear itself apart under its own weight." I didn't move to Martha's Vineyard. I drove 2 hours north past the Massachusetts border to a desolate stretch of coastline near New Bedford. The area was old, gray, and smelled of low tide and rusted diesel tanks, a far cry from the manicured lawns of Newport. There, tucked between an abandoned fish processing plant and a tidal salt marsh, was a derelict shipyard called Narragansett Iron and Hull. It had been bankrupt since the late 90s, its single marine railway overgrown with sea lavender and spartina grass. I bought the property using the entirety of my savings and a heavy mortgage taken against the small cottage my grandmother had left me personally. It wasn't $10 million. It was barely enough to repair the roof of the main fabrication shed, clear the silt from the deep water slipway, and install a modern 3-phase electrical grid. I called the new company Meridian Marine. For the first 6 months, I lived in a small loft apartment above the tool shed. The wind whistled through the corrugated steel walls, and the winter nights were so cold that the water in my kettle would freeze if I didn't leave the stove on a low simmer. But I wasn't alone. One morning in early November, a rusty Chevy Silverado pulled into the gravel lot of Meridian Marine. The door opened, and out stepped Thomas, the master shipwright from Vance Marine, followed by 3 of the senior laminators I had worked with for years. "Thomas," I said, stepping down from the loft stairs, a drafting pen behind my ear. "What are you doing up here?" The old man spat into the gravel and looked around the cavernous, empty fabrication shed. "The boys from New York arrived at Vance last week, Clara. They brought in a bunch of consultants with clipboards who told us we were being transitioned into facility maintenance specialists. They're shutting down the custom build line next month. They offered us a severance package that wouldn't cover a year's worth of groceries." He looked at me, his eyes sharp beneath his bushy gray brows. "We heard you bought this old wreck of a yard. We don't mind the cold and we don't mind hard work, but we aren't going to spend our remaining years building fiberglass docks for yachts that never leave the harbor. We want to build real boats." "I can't pay you Newport wages, Thomas," I said openly. "Not yet." "We didn't ask for Newport wages," Thomas replied, setting his heavy canvas tool bag down on the concrete floor. "We asked for work that matters. Now show us what you're designing on that screen." Over the next year, the abandoned shed became a hive of quiet, furious industry. While my brothers were busy celebrating the initial public announcements of their acquisition by Vanguard Maritime, we were working 14-hour days in the freezing cold. My revenge wasn't going to be a lawsuit. It was going to be an engineering triumph. The international yachting world was changing. The old multimillionaires who wanted floating palaces with gold-plated fixtures were being superseded by a new generation of competitive sailors, tech founders, green energy tycoons, and international syndicates who wanted ultralight, incredibly fast, and ecologically sound racing vessels. They wanted boats that could cross the Atlantic in record time without burning thousands of gallons of fuel. I took my vacuum infusion resin designs, the ones my brothers had dismissed as fiberglass playthings, and perfected them. By using a proprietary blend of bioresins derived from industrial flax and a multi-directional carbon weave, we created a hull material that was 40% stronger than standard carbon fiber, but weighed significantly less. We built the prototype in total secrecy. We didn't issue press releases, we didn't post on social media, we kept the shed doors closed, the windows blackened with plastic sheeting, and the operations under wraps. Meanwhile, I kept a close eye on Vance Marine. The reports from Newport were predictable. Julian and Sterling had used the first influx of Vanguard cash to buy themselves new estates and a luxury apartment in Manhattan. But the corporate transition wasn't going well. The high-end clients who had stayed loyal to my father for decades didn't want to deal with a faceless private equity firm. When they called the office, they didn't get a master shipwright or an experienced engineer. They got a 24-year-old account executive with an MBA who didn't know the difference between a skeg and a rudder. Then came the announcement of the Oceanus Cup. The Oceanus Cup was the holy grail of American yacht racing, a grueling, non-stop, 2,000-mile race from Newport to the Azores Islands off the coast of Portugal. It was the ultimate showcase for marine technology, attended by every major maritime family, industrialist, and defense contractor in the Western world. 2 months before the race, Vance Marine announced their flagship entry, the Vance Vanguard. It was a 70-foot racing machine, built using automated assembly techniques at their new outsourced facility. Julian and Sterling had spent millions marketing it as the future of American yachting. They intended to use the race to finalize the second stage of their corporate buyout, which would net them another $100 million each. The day after their press conference, I picked up the phone and called an old college classmate of mine, Alistair Vance Croft, no relation, though his family held a massive shipping empire in the UK. Alistair was an eccentric billionaire who had spent his life trying to break the transatlantic monohull speed record. "Clara," Alistair said, his voice crackling over the satellite phone from his office in London. "I saw the news about your brother's new boat. Looks flash. I suppose you're out of the game entirely now?" "I'm not out of the game, Alistair," I said, leaning back against my drafting desk, looking out at the dark, sleek shape of our prototype sitting in the center of the shed. "I built something better than a 70-foot automated carbon hull backed by $50 million of New York venture capital. Come to New Bedford on Friday," I said. "Bring your sailing gear. If the boat doesn't break 28 knots in a 10-knot breeze, I'll pay for your fuel back to London." He arrived on Friday. The wind was blowing 20 knots out of the east. A cold, nasty chop that would make any standard racing hull slam violently against the water. We launched our prototype, which Alistair had christened the Nemesis. It was a 65-foot Plumbo racer, completely unpainted, its raw carbon weave hull gleaming like the skin of a deep-sea predator. Alistair took the wheel himself. Thomas and our crew handled the sheets. When the mainsail caught the wind, the Nemesis didn't just accelerate, it leaped. Because of the ultra-lightweight flax carbon composite and the custom hull geometry I had spent 3 years refining, the boat didn't plow through the waves, it skimmed over them with an eerie, frictionless silence. The typical shuddering vibration of a racing yacht at high speed was completely absent. Alistair looked at the digital speedo on the mast, 28 knots, 30 knots, 34 knots. He let out a loud, wild laugh that was swallowed by the roar of the wind. "My God, Clara! She's not riding the water, she's flying. She handles like a 30-foot dinghy but has the power of a locomotive." He brought the boat about, his knuckles white on the carbon wheel. When we returned to the dock, he jumped ashore, ignored the mud ruined his handmade shoes, and grabbed me by the shoulders. "We enter her in the Oceanus Cup," he said, his eyes bright with competitive fire. "We register her under the Meridian Marine flag. I will fund the entire campaign. We're going to show those polished boys in Newport what a real boat looks like." "There's only one condition, Alistair," I said, looking down at my calloused hands. "Name it. I sail on the boat. I want to be on the water when we pass them." The week before the Oceanus Cup, Newport was a sea of white tents, blue blazers, and brass buttons. The harbor was jammed with the most expensive vessels in the world, but the undisputed center of attention was the Vance Vanguard. She sat at the main terminal slipway, her pristine white hull corporate branded with the logos of international banks and investment funds. Julian and Sterling were in their element. They had organized the pre-race Heritage Gala at the Rosecliff Mansion, the same venue where our father used to take us when we were children. I arrived late. I didn't wear overalls this time. I wore a tailored midnight blue silk dress that matched the deep color of the Atlantic at dusk. My hair, usually tied back in a messy bun with a piece of rigging twine, fell over my shoulders. I didn't look like the girl from the dry docks anymore. I looked like a Vance who had returned from exile. The grand ballroom was deafeningly loud with the chatter of 300 high society guests when I walked through the arched stone doorways. It didn't take long for the crowd to notice me. The whispers started near the champagne fountain and rippled toward the veranda. "Clara?" I turned around to find Julian standing there, a glass of crystal-clear gin in his hand. Sterling was right behind him, his expression immediately hardening into a defensive glare. "What are you doing here?" Sterling asked, his voice low so the nearby guests wouldn't hear. "This is a private event for registered entrants and sponsors. Security should have kept you at the gate." "I am a registered entrant, Sterling," I said, taking a glass of white wine from a passing waiter's tray. "And a sponsor. Alistair Croft and I registered our vessel on Tuesday morning." Julian laughed, a sharp, patronizing sound. "That old relic of a yard in New Bedford? We heard you bought that swamp property, Clara. What did you enter?" "A rebuilt wooden lobster boat. The Oceanus Cup is an open ocean race for elite vessels, not a local regatta." "We entered a 65-foot custom composite monohull," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "Her name is Nemesis. You might want to look up her handicap rating on the official race board. The committee finalized it this afternoon." Sterling's phone buzzed in his breast pocket. He pulled it out, his thumb scrolling quickly through his notifications. I watched the color drain from his face in real time. It was a beautiful thing to witness, the precise moment when a corporate facade encounters an unyielding engineering reality. "Julian," Sterling muttered, his voice shaking slightly as he held the screen out for his brother to see. "Look at this. Croft Syndicate didn't buy a European design. They registered a hull designed by Meridian LLC, the initial sea trial data from the tracking transponders. It's listed here. They clocked 34 knots in a gale off Cuttyhunk." Julian snatched the phone from his brother's hand. His eyes widened as he read the technical specifications. This is impossible. A monohull of this displacement can't hit those speeds without hydrofoils. It defies the physics of the hull speed formula." "It doesn't defy physics if you know how to reduce skin friction and structural weight without sacrificing keel ballast, Julian," I said, taking a slow sip of my wine. "But then again, you always were more focused on the horizon than the bolts." A small circle of guests had begun to gather around us, including several senior executives from Vanguard Maritime Holdings and a 2-star admiral from the Coast Guard's procurement division. "Clara Vance?" the Admiral asked, stepping forward, his eyes fixed on me. Are you the Vance engineer who developed the vacuum infusion laminate structures? The ones that were rumored to have been sold to Vanguard? I am the engineer who developed them, Admiral, I said clearly, ensuring my voice carried across the immediate circle. But they were never sold to Vanguard. My brothers tried to claim the intellectual property, but the patents remain registered to my independent design firm. The boat sitting in New Bedford is built entirely on that technology. The Admiral turned his gaze to Julian, his brow furrowed. Julian, your prospectus for the second phase of the Vanguard buyout stated that your firm held exclusive global rights to those specific high-strength composite designs. That's the entire reason the Coast Guard Engineering Board agreed to review your patrol boat bid next month. Julian's collar looked suddenly very tight. He cleared his throat, a sweat breaking out along his hairline. Admiral, there seems to be a minor administrative misunderstanding regarding the subsidiary patents. Our legal team is currently handling the clarification. There is no misunderstanding, I interrupted smoothly. They don't have the patents, they don't have the shipwrights who know how to lay the carbon fibers without creating structural voids. And if you take a look at the Vance Vanguard down at the docks, you'll find that her hull skin was laid by automated commercial machines that leave microscopic pockets of air in the resin matrix. In a calm sea, she's perfectly fine, but in 40-foot waves in the mid-Atlantic, she's a structural hazard. This is slander, Sterling hissed, stepping toward me, his fists clenched at his sides. We will have our lawyers serve you with an injunction before the race begins tomorrow morning. Go ahead, I said, tilting my head back. The race starts at 10 o'clock. The starting line is in international waters 3 miles out from Fort Adams. Your local injunctions don't run out there, Sterling. I'll see you on the water. I turned my back on them and walked out of the ballroom, leaving my brothers standing in the center of the room as the murmurs of their investors and clients rose like a gathering tide around them. The Atlantic Ocean doesn't care about family trees, corporate mergers, or $300 million liquidity events. When you pass the continental shelf and the water drops to a deep, terrifying midnight blue, the world simplifies into 2 elements: the wind and the structure beneath your feet. The start of the Oceanus Cup was a chaotic mess of salt spray and canvas. 30 vessels crossed the line under a heavy, low sky that promised dirty weather by nightfall. The Vance Vanguard took an early lead, her massive sail plan catching the clean air off the point. Julian and Sterling weren't on board. They had hired a professional crew of elite Kiwi and European sailors to manage their investment, but they were watching from a luxury tender boat near the harbor entrance, flashing their cameras. We stayed to the south, keeping the Nemesis on a conservative line as we cleared Block Island. The barometer is dropping like stone, Clara, Thomas yelled over the roar of the water, his old face soaked in brine as he checked the tension on the primary winches. We're going to get slammed by a low-pressure system coming up from the Carolinas. It's going to be a real blow tonight. Keep the staysail ready, Thomas, I shouted back from my position near the navigation station. We aren't falling back, we stay on their quarter. By midnight, the race had turned into an ordeal. The wind had risen to 45 knots, screaming through the high modulus rigging like a dying animal. The waves were towering, black walls of water, 20 to 30 feet high, their crests breaking into blinding sheets of white spray that felt like needles against our faces. Most of the fleet had tacked north to seek shelter near the coast, or had dropped their mainsails entirely to ride out the storm. Only 2 boats remained on the direct, aggressive route to the Azores, the Vance Vanguard and the Nemesis. Through the night vision binoculars, I watched the white shape of my brother's boat half a mile ahead of us. She was struggling. Her automated systems were constantly dumping air from her sails to prevent her from capsizing, but her heavy, stiff hull was slamming into the troughs of the waves with a horrific metallic thud that resonated through the water. Every time she slammed, I felt a phantom pain in my own ribs. I knew exactly what was happening inside that automated hull. The air pockets, the microscopic flaws that the New York consultants had dismissed as within acceptable manufacturing tolerances, were being subjected to thousands of tons of cyclic pressure. The resin was beginning to microfracture. The carbon layers were starting to separate from each other, like a deck of cards being flexed until the glue fails. "Clara!" Alistair shouted from the helm, his face illuminated by the green glow of the instrument panel. "Their speed is dropping. They've slowed to 12 knots. They're taking a massive pounding. Bring us up on their windward side, Alistair," I commanded, strapping myself into the safety harness. "Let's see what she's made of." As the Nemesis surged forward, her flax carbon hull absorbed the impact of the waves with a damp, solid thud. The natural fibers in our composite material acted like a microscopic shock absorption network, flexing just enough to dissipate the energy before passing it to the keel. It was the difference between a tree branches that bends in the wind and stone wall that shatters when hit by a battering ram. We pulled level with the Vance Vanguard at 3 a.m., in the absolute heart of the pitch-black storm. Suddenly, a sound cut through the roar of the wind, a sharp, terrifying crack that sounded like a rifle shot over the water. It was followed by a long, low groan of tearing composite material. Through the darkness, I saw the Vance Vanguard lurch violently to port. Her bow dropped into a wave and didn't come back up. The structural skin of her forward hull had delaminated under the immense pressure, the fiberglass tearing away from the internal bulkheads like wet cardboard. Water was rushing into her forward compartments by the ton. Her crew fired a red distress flare into the sky. The crimson light cast a bloody, surreal glow over the foaming sea, illuminating the panicked movements of the sailors on deck as they scrambled for their life rafts. "They're sinking, Clara," Thomas called out, his voice tight with anxiety. The hulls splitting wide open. In that moment, everything stood still. I could have told Alistair to keep driving. We could have sailed past them, claimed our historic victory, and left the International Rescue Coordination Center to pick up the pieces. The destruction of that boat would be the ultimate public annihilation of my brother's corporate credibility. It would ruin Vance Marine's stock value overnight, void their contract with Vanguard, and expose Julian and Sterling as incompetent frauds before the entire global maritime industry. It was exactly the revenge I had spent 18 months working for. But then I looked at the men on that sinking deck. They weren't Julian and Sterling. They were professional sailors, men who had wives, children, and a deep respect for the sea. They were my people. And my father's voice echoed in my head, clear as a church bell over the water. "The ocean doesn't care about your grievances, Clara. You never leave a man behind." "Alistair, drop the mainsail," I screamed, my voice cracking with the effort. "We're coming about. Prepare the lines and the rescue slings. We're taking them on board." Thomas looked at me, a sudden, fierce pride shining through the salt crust on his old face. "You heard her, boys. Get the lines ready. We're going to work." For the next 2 hours, we fought the Atlantic for the lives of the Vance Vanguard's crew. Alistair held the Nemesis steady in the roaring sea with an incredible display of seamanship, positioning our hull just close enough to allow the 8 soaked, freezing sailors to jump from their disintegrating life raft onto our deck. The skipper of their boat, a legendary Kiwi sailor named Campbell, was the last one to climb over our lifelines. He collapsed onto our deck, coughing up seawater, his hands shaking as Thomas wrapped him in a heavy wool blanket. He looked up at the raw carbon deck beneath him, then up at the mast, and finally at me, standing over him with a thermos of hot coffee. Your hull," Campbell stammered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "She's not flexing, she's solid as a rock. Who built this boat?" "I did," I said, handing him the cup. "Welcome aboard the Nemesis." As the first gray light of dawn broke through the dissipating storm clouds to the east, we watched the final remnants of the Vance Vanguard sink beneath the waves, 200 miles off the coast of New England. The $5 million corporate flagship was gone, swallowed by the cold Atlantic, leaving nothing behind but a slick of hydraulic fluid and a few pieces of floating foam insulation. The aftermath of a storm is always quiet. The water returns to its flat, gray indifference, erasing the footprints of the struggle as if it never happened. We didn't finish the race to the Azores. We turned back toward Newport to deliver the injured crew to the hospital. But we didn't need to cross the finish line to win. When the Nemesis sailed past Fort Adams and entered Newport Harbor 48 hours later, she didn't return as an obscure entrant from an old shipyard. She returned with the entire crew of the sunken flagship on her deck, saved by the structural integrity of a design my brothers had called a fiberglass plaything. The news of the disaster had preceded us. The maritime world was in a frenzy. The failure of the Vance Vanguard hull had sent shockwaves through Wall Street. Within 24 hours of the sinking, Vanguard Maritime Holdings invoked the Material Adverse Change Clause in their contract, pulling out of the buyout deal entirely and demanding the immediate return of their initial investments. The downfall of Julian and Sterling was swift, public, and total. They had leveraged everything they owned to fund the race campaign and their new luxury lifestyles, confident that the final payout from Vanguard would clear their debts. Now, they were left with a bankrupt company, millions of dollars in personal liabilities, an impending federal investigation by the Coast Guard into corporate safety standards, and a series of massive lawsuits from their remaining clients. A week after our return, I walked back into the corporate offices of Vance Marine. The building was nearly empty. The secretaries had left. The expensive modern art had been taken down from the walls by creditors, and the air smelled faintly of dust and old paper. Julian and Sterling were sitting in the formal boardroom, surrounded by stacks of legal briefs and foreclosure notices. They didn't look like princes anymore. Their suits were wrinkled, their faces pale and sunken, and they looked old, 10 years older than they had at the Rosecliff Gala. They looked up as I entered, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind me. "Are you here to gloat, Clara?" Sterling asked, his voice raw and broken. He didn't even have the energy to look angry. "You won. The board declared bankruptcy this morning. The shipyard property, the patents, the family name, it's all going to be auctioned off to the highest bidder next month by the liquidators." I walked to the head of the table, the seat where my father used to sit, and set a thick folder down on the mahogany surface. "I'm not here to gloat, Sterling," I said quietly. "I'm here to buy you out." Julian looked up, his eyes widening slightly. "Buy us out? With what money? You don't have the capital to clear our debts." "I don't," I said, "but the Alistair Croft Syndicate does, and so does the United States Coast Guard." I opened the folder, revealing a signed multi-year procurement contract bearing the official seal of the Department of Homeland Security. "The Coast Guard canceled their review of your patrol boat bid the day after the Vanguard sank," I explained, my voice steady and calm. "They spent the last 4 days reviewing the telemetry data from the Nemesis during the storm. They checked our vacuum infusion laminate logs and structural stress tests. Yesterday morning, they awarded Meridian Marine the exclusive contract for the next generation of high-speed rescue craft. It's an $80 million commitment." I slid 2 legal documents across the table toward them. "This is an asset purchase agreement," I said. "My syndicate is buying the physical assets of Vance Marine, the Newport dry docks, the old fabrication sheds, and the land from the liquidators. And this second document is a personal release form for both of you." Julian picked up the paper with a trembling hand. "What is this?" "I'm clearing your personal debts with the primary banks," I said. "You won't go to jail, and you won't be forced to file for personal destitution. You will keep your personal homes, but your association with Vance Marine ends today. You will surrender all remaining shares, all claims to the family name in the maritime industry, and you will never step foot on these docks again." Sterling stared at the document, a single tear cutting a clean line through the dust on his face. "You're completely erasing us from the business." "No," I said, looking out the window at the old dry docks, where Thomas and a group of newly reinstated shipwrights were already clearing away the corporate signs left by Vanguard. "You erased yourselves when you forgot that a boat is built to protect the people inside it, not just to look good on a balance sheet. I'm just restoring the foundation." Julian looked at me for a long, silent moment, realizing that the sister they had dismissed as a mere tradesman had used the very rules of their corporate game to dismantle them, piece by piece, without ever losing her honor. He picked up a pen and signed his name at the bottom of the page. Sterling followed a moment later, his hand shaking so badly the signature was barely legible. "Thank you, Clara," Julian whispered, not looking me in the eye. "Don't thank me," I said, taking the signed documents and sliding them back into my folder. "Thank the shipwrights who built the Nemesis. They're the ones who saved your lives." I turned and walked out of the boardroom for the final time. As I walked down the stairs and out onto the tarmac, the fog was finally beginning to lift over the Narragansett Bay, revealing the bright, hard blue of the Atlantic Ocean beyond the breakwater. The air was clean, sharp, and filled with the familiar, beautiful sound of steel mallets striking brass, the sound of a structure being built to last.